The dust settled in layers, a fine red powder on his grief. Caleb guided the weary horse and the creaking wagon toward the silhouette of a house that sagged like a tired old man. $1. That was the price for this square of sun-baked oblivion, a place where the horizon was a blade that severed a man from his past. The air was thick with the scent of dry grass, and a silence so profound it felt heavier than sound. He'd counted out the 4 quarters himself, the last of the money from the sale of his real life, the one with Sarah. 421 days since he'd last heard her laugh. He stopped the horse near a trough filled with cracked earth and spider webs. The main house was a skeleton, its windows vacant eyes staring into the relentless blue sky. But it was the smaller structure, a line shack hunched near a cluster of stubborn, dusty trees that held his gaze. A flicker. A trick of the light, perhaps, a reflection off a shard of glass. Then it came again, the soft, trembling glow of a candle. He wasn't alone. He slid from the wagon, his boots making no sound in the thick dust. Every muscle ached with a weariness that had little to do with the journey. He moved toward the shack, his hand resting on nothing, for he had sold his pistol along with the rest of it. He had no fight left in him. He peered through a grimy pane of glass. Inside, a young woman knelt on the floor. She was Chinese, her black hair in a simple braid, her body wrapped in a dress of faded, worn red silk, a slash of defiant color in the monochrome poverty of the room. A single candle cast dancing shadows on the weathered wood walls. In front of her was a small bowl and a nearly empty sack of rice. With intense, heartbreaking precision, she was counting. One by one, she picked up single grains of rice with chopsticks and placed them in the bowl. Her lips moved, but the sound was too soft to hear. It was a ritual of survival, a desperate accounting of her remaining moments. Caleb watched this quiet act of desperation, and the anger he expected to feel, the territorial rage of a landowner, never came. All he felt was a vast, hollow echo of his own emptiness. He saw a soul pared down to its very essence, and it was a mirror. He stepped back and knocked gently on the doorframe, the sound unnervingly loud in the great silence. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with the terror of a cornered animal. The chopsticks clattered to the floor. May's world had shrunk to the 4 walls of the shack, to the rising and setting of a sun she no longer saw as a promise. It was simply a clock, measuring the slow depletion of her father's rice. When the knock came, her heart seized. It was always a man, and a man's knock always meant a demand. She looked at the stranger filling the doorway, his frame blocking the last of the sunset. He was tall and gaunt, his face shadowed by a dusty hat. But it was his stillness that was most unnerving. He wasn't aggressive, not puffed up with the arrogance she had come to expect. He just stood there, his eyes holding a weariness that she recognized. He looked at the spilled grains of rice on the floor, then at her. His gaze wasn't accusatory. It was something quieter, something that felt like understanding. He gestured vaguely toward the dilapidated main house. "I bought the deed," he said. His voice was raspy, unused. May simply nodded, her hands clenched in the folds of her red cheongsam. This was it. She had nowhere to go. The desert on one side, a hostile town on the other. She braced herself for the inevitable command to leave. Instead, he looked from the big house back to her small shack. He sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of a whole lifetime. "You can stay," he said, and then turned and walked away toward his wagon, as if the matter was settled, as if he had no more words left for the world. For days they lived as ghosts in the same space. He began the Herculean task of making the main house habitable, hauling out debris, patching the roof with salvaged planks. She watched him from a distance, a silent observer of his dogged, joyless labor. She continued her own routines, tending the small, secret patch of hardy greens she cultivated behind the shack, checking the snares her father had taught her to set. One afternoon, he wrestled with the rusted cook stove in the main house, trying to get a fire to catch. A sudden backdraft sent a plume of black soot billowing into his face. He stumbled back, coughing, his face a comical mask of black and white. From her doorway, May saw it, and a feeling so alien it startled her rose in her chest. It was the shadow of a smile. She pressed her lips together, but he saw her. He just stared for a moment, then wiped a hand across his cheek, smearing the soot into a long, dark streak. He didn't scowl. He just turned back to the stove with the quiet resignation of a man for whom things going wrong was the natural state of being. The rhythm of their days took on a strange, unspoken shape. Caleb would work until the sun bled across the sky, his movements slow but relentless. May would gather what she could, her existence a quiet counterpoint to his noisy repairs. He never intruded on her shack. She never crossed the threshold of the main house. The space between them was a territory of mutual respect for each other's solitude. One evening, as he sat on the porch steps trying to plane a warped piece of wood, he watched her meticulously mending a tear in the sleeve of her red dress. The silk was thin, the color of a dying ember in the twilight, but her stitches were impossibly small and neat. He got up and walked over, his shadow falling over her work. "That's a fine stitch," he said, his voice less rough than before. She didn't look up, her focus absolute. "My mother taught me. She said a good stitch makes old things new." The words were soft, tinged with an accent that was like music. Caleb leaned against the porch rail, the wood warm from the day's heat. "My wife, Sarah," he said, the name feeling strange and heavy in the air. "She had a touch for it. Mended my shirts so you couldn't even see the tear. Said it was like putting the world right, one stitch at a time." He fell silent, lost in the memory. May paused her needle, a silent acknowledgment of the name he had offered, a piece of his past laid bare. Later that week, she found a handful of sun-ripened wild berries. She washed them and placed them in a small tin cup, which she left on the porch railing for him. It was a gift, an offering. That night, he approached her as she sat outside her shack, watching the stars begin to prick the deep indigo sky. He held the empty cup. "Thank you." She gave a slight nod. A long silence stretched between them, comfortable now. "How long have you been here alone?" he asked, his question gentle. She looked toward the dark shape of the mountains. "After my father passed, I lost count of the seasons. The sun comes up, the sun goes down. It is enough to know that." He looked down at his own calloused hands, as if the answer were written there. "It's been 438 days for me," he said. "I count them all." It was a confession, a sharing of the weight they both carried. In that moment, they were no longer just a man and a woman on a desolate ranch, but two people who understood the lonely arithmetic of loss. The summer deepened, the heat becoming a physical presence that baked the land and frayed the nerves. Then the well pump broke. The squeal of the handle became a dry, grating groan, and the gush of water slowed to a trickle, then stopped altogether. For 2 days, Caleb fought with it. He disassembled the mechanism, his knuckles bleeding, his frustration mounting with every stripped bolt and rusted joint. The well was their only source of water for miles. Without it, the ranch was just a patch of dying earth, and they were just two people waiting to be driven out by thirst. His anger was a cold, hard thing in his chest, a fury at this broken piece of metal, at this broken land, at a broken life that refused to be mended. He finally threw his wrench down in disgust, the clang echoing in the oppressive stillness. He slumped against the well, defeated. May had been watching from the porch. She had said nothing, her presence a silent vigil. Now she walked over. In her hands she held a thin piece of wire and a small, supple strip of leather she had cut from an old pair of her father's boots. She didn't speak. She knelt beside the disassembled pump, and with deft fingers she began to work the leather into the part of the plunger where the seal had rotted away, using the wire to bind it tightly in place. Her movements were economical and precise, a language of pure function. Caleb watched, his frustration giving way to a grudging admiration. He had been trying to force the machine, to bend it to his will. She was coaxing it, understanding its weakness and offering a solution. He knelt beside her. "Here," he grunted, picking up a tool and holding a piece steady for her. Their hands brushed. Her skin was cool. They worked together in silence, a shared, focused intensity passing between them. He moved as she guided, his strength complementing her ingenuity. It took another hour, but finally they reassembled the pump. Caleb took the handle, his muscles tensing. He pumped once, twice, and then they heard it, a low gurgle from the depths of the earth, followed by a rush of clear, cold water splashing onto the dry ground. A wave of relief, so potent it was almost dizzying, washed over him. He looked at May, who was watching the life-giving water, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips for the first time. In that sunset, with the water pooling at their feet, he saw her not as a problem he had inherited, but as the reason this desolate place might just be saved. A change had settled over the ranch, as gentle and profound as the shift of a season. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with a quiet companionship. They began to share a space, if not yet a life. One morning, Caleb turned his attention to a derelict buckboard wagon that lay behind the barn like the bleached bones of some ancient creature. One wheel was shattered, the axle was bent, and the wood of the bed was splintered and gray. It was a useless, broken thing, a monument to decay. To try and fix it was a fool's errand. And that's why he began. He dragged the heavy, rotting pieces out into the sunlight, the task so large it was calming. It was a problem of physics, of wood and iron, not of the heart. He could lose himself in the simple, brutal work of it. As he labored under the hot sun, trying to steam and bend a new piece of hickory for the wheel rim, May began to bring him a jar of cool water from the newly repaired well. She would set it down on a nearby crate without a word and retreat. Then, one day, she brought the water and a small, perfectly white steamed bun on a tin plate. It was an offering of unimaginable luxury. Flour was precious, a commodity to be hoarded. He stopped his work, wiping the sweat and grime from his hands onto his trousers. He took the bun, his rough, scarred fingers brushing against hers. The touch was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through the tired air between them. "Thank you, May," he said, his voice low. "It is only flour," she replied, but she didn't look away. Her eyes held a depth he was only just beginning to understand. They started eating their evening meals at the same time, sitting on opposite ends of the long porch, the restored wagon parts lying in the yard between them. The distance began to shrink. He found himself telling her about the farm he and Sarah had built from nothing, the color of the corn in September, the weight of a perfect apple in his hand. She, in turn, told him of her home across the ocean, a place of green mountains and noisy rivers, and of the long boat journey with her father, who had believed the stories of a mountain of gold and found only a mountain of rock and railroad ties. They were piecing together their broken histories, offering the shards to one another. The wagon was slowly, impossibly, beginning to look like a wagon again, and so were they. The first trip to town was a necessity that felt like a betrayal of their quiet world. The larder was nearly bare, and the tools Caleb needed to finish the wagon couldn't be fashioned from scrap and hope. He stood by the porch as May handed him a small, folded piece of paper. On it she had drawn pictures, a sack with the character for salt, a block of lard, a needle and thread. Her drawings were as delicate and precise as her stitches. He felt a clumsy thickness in his own hands as he took the list. "Anything else?" he asked. She hesitated, then added a quick sketch of a small flowering herb. "For tea," she said softly. "It helps with the quiet." He understood. The silence in his own head was a roar he was constantly trying to quell. The town of Redemption was a single dusty street squinting in the sun. Inside the general store, the air was thick with the smells of coffee beans, leather, and dried apples. The proprietor, a man named Henderson with kind eyes and a fringe of white hair, watched Caleb gather his supplies. "You're the one took the old Miller place," Henderson stated, not asked. Caleb nodded. "Heard you paid $1 for it. The Miller boys ain't too happy. They figured to let it rot and claim it back for taxes owed." He paused, leaning on the counter. "Heard you ain't alone out there, neither." Caleb's jaw tightened. He set a heavy sack of flour on the counter, the dust rising in a small cloud. "I have a tenant," he said, his voice flat. Henderson just polished a pair of spectacles. "Folks in this town, they can be unkind to difference. The railroad brought all sorts and left a lot of trouble in its wake. You watch yourself. And her." Caleb looked at the shelves, at the small domestic items that spoke of a life he once knew. He saw spools of thread in a wooden box. On an impulse that came from a place deeper than thought, he picked up a spool of vibrant red silk, the color of a sunset, the color of May's dress. He added it to his pile. "She's a good stitcher," Caleb said, more to himself than to Henderson. The store owner smiled, a small, knowing expression. "A good stitch can hold a world together," he said, echoing a sentiment so close to Sarah's it made Caleb's chest ache. He paid for his goods, the jingle of coins loud in the quiet store, and left with the feeling that he had crossed a line, declaring to the world that the small ranch was no longer a refuge for one, but a fortress for two. He returned as dusk was settling, the air cooling and turning purple. May was on the porch, a small, still figure in the growing shadows. He unloaded the supplies, placing the sacks of flour and salt and the block of lard on the porch. Lastly, he held out the small spool of red thread. Her eyes widened almost imperceptibly as she saw it. It was a luxury, a frivolity, an object of pure beauty in a life that had been stripped of everything but function. She took it from his calloused palm, her fingers tracing the smooth silk. She didn't say thank you, but she looked at him, and in her gaze was a story of gratitude so profound it needed no words. He felt the warmth of it spread through him, a feeling he had thought long dead. The next day they finished the wagon. He had fitted the last wheel that morning, and now, together, they were rubbing it down with linseed oil, their hands moving in a shared rhythmic motion. The wood drank in the oil, its grain deepening from a sun-bleached gray to a rich, warm brown. It looked whole. It looked strong. It looked ready. The setting sun cast their shadows long across the yard, merging them into one. "It is finished," May said, her voice soft with wonder. "Yes," Caleb said, looking not at the wagon but at her face, illuminated in the golden light. "It's ready for a journey." She turned to him, her expression open, vulnerable. "Where would such a journey go?" she asked. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities. He could feel the count in his head, the relentless tick of days since Sarah, but for the first time the number felt distant, the edges blurred. He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were slender but strong, and they curled around his. "I used to count every day I was alone," he confessed, his voice thick. 457 of them. But lately I find I'm losing track. It was the truest thing he had said in over a year. He was no longer just marking time. He was living it. The wagon stood before them, a testament not to what was broken, but to what could be rebuilt together. The journey, he realized, had already begun. The next morning broke with a fragile sense of peace. For the first time, Caleb woke not with a leaden weight in his soul, but with a quiet sense of purpose. He saw May tending her small garden, the red of her dress a vibrant flame against the dusty earth, and he felt the stirrings of a simple, profound happiness. The hope was so new, so delicate, he was almost afraid to breathe on it. That was when he saw them. 2 riders, appearing first as shimmering silhouettes on the horizon, slowly resolving into men. A knot of cold dread formed in his stomach. They rode with an arrogant slouch, their horses kicking up plumes of dust that signaled a contempt for the land and anyone on it. They reined in their horses a few feet from the porch, their hard eyes sweeping over the tidy yard, the repaired well, the finished wagon, and finally settling on May, who had straightened up, her face a calm, unreadable mask. "Well, well," the bigger of the 2 men said, a cruel smile twisting his lips. He had a fleshy face and small, piggy eyes. "Look what the cat dragged in, Silas. Looks like the squatter's been busy." The other man, thinner and more weaselly, spat a stream of tobacco juice near May's feet. "That's Miller land you're on, mister, and that's Miller property you're with." Caleb moved to stand slightly in front of May, his body a quiet shield. He recognized them from Henderson's vague description. The Miller boys. "I bought this land," Caleb said, his voice even, betraying none of the cold fury coiling inside him. "Paid $1 for the deed, free and clear." Jed, the larger one, laughed, a harsh, grating sound. $1? Pa was a sentimental old fool. He didn't know the railroad was thinking of putting a spur line through here. This land's worth a damn sight more than $1 now, and we're here to correct his mistake. His gaze slid back to May, ugly and possessive. "We'll take the land. You can have the $1 back. And we'll take care of the tenant." The threat was unmistakable, hanging in the dry air like poison. May did not flinch, did not retreat. She stood her ground, her dignity a silent rebuke to their coarseness. Caleb felt a surge of protective rage so fierce it nearly choked him. He had come here to die, in a way. He had not expected to find something worth fighting for. The confrontation stretched thin, a wire pulled taut and humming with menace. Silas swung down from his horse, his spurs jingling, and took a swaggering step toward the porch. "Pa should have run her off when he had the chance. Ain't right her being here." Caleb didn't move, didn't raise his voice. He just stood there, his stillness a greater obstacle than any wall. "This is my home," he said, the words simple and solid as rock. He turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting May's. "And this is her home." The shared declaration, the hour, settled between them, an unbreakable bond forged in that moment. Jed's face darkened with fury. He was used to bluster and intimidation working. This quiet defiance was something he didn't understand and couldn't abide. "You got 2 days to clear out," he snarled, "or we'll come back with the sheriff, and a court order says this sale ain't valid on account of Pa being of unsound mind." It was a lie, and they all knew it. But the law in a town like Redemption was often a matter of who could shout the loudest. It was then that May stepped forward, moving to stand beside Caleb, not behind him. She looked directly at the 2 brothers, her small frame radiating a strength that belied her size. "We are not leaving," she said, her English clear and precise. The word "we" struck the Miller boys like a physical blow. Before they could reply, another sound broke the tense silence, the steady, rhythmic creak of an approaching wagon. All 4 of them turned to look. It was Mr. Henderson's supply wagon, rolling slowly up the path. He pulled his horse to a halt, his calm, assessing gaze taking in the scene, the armed and angry brothers, the quiet couple standing shoulder to shoulder on the porch. "Caleb," Henderson said, his voice pleasant but firm, carrying a weight of authority. "Forgot to give you your receipt yesterday. Figured I'd drop it by." He tipped his hat to the Miller boys. "Jed? Silas? Didn't expect to see you boys so far from the saloon." The brothers exchanged a look. Their power lay in isolating their victims, in the belief that no one would care what happened out on this desolate patch of land. Henderson's presence, his casual, public acknowledgment of Caleb, shattered that illusion. He was a witness. Jed grunted, his bluster deflating. "Just visiting an old friend," he muttered, swinging his horse around. "Let's go, Silas." They kicked their horses into a gallop, fleeing not from a fight, but from the simple, unassailable presence of communal decency. The dust from the Miller boys' departure settled back onto the earth, and a profound quiet returned, deeper and more peaceful than before. Mr. Henderson simply handed a slip of paper to Caleb. "My wife made too much bread this morning," he said, gesturing to a cloth-wrapped loaf on his wagon seat. "Figured you two could use it." It was an act of solidarity, an acceptance. Caleb nodded, his throat too tight for words. "Thank you, Henderson." The store owner just smiled his knowing smile, turned his wagon, and headed back toward town, leaving them once more in the sanctuary of their shared solitude. Caleb and May stood on the porch for a long time, the warmth of the morning sun on their faces. The threat had passed, leaving behind not fear, but a certainty. He turned to her, his eyes searching her face. "Are you all right?" he asked. She met his gaze, and for the first time he saw not just resilience, not just quiet strength, but a deep and abiding tenderness that was a mirror of his own. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm, her touch both a comfort and a promise. "We are all right," she corrected him softly. Later, they walked to the finished buckboard. It sat in the yard, sturdy and whole, the oiled wood glowing in the sunlight. It was a symbol of their shared labor, a testament to their ability to create something strong and beautiful from broken pieces. He still had the dollar coin in his pocket, the one he'd paid for the deed. He took it out, its silver surface worn smooth. $1, he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Best dollar I ever spent." May looked from the coin to the house to the wide open land around them, and finally to him. A genuine, radiant smile lit up her entire face. "It bought more than land," she said. He took her hand, their fingers lacing together naturally, perfectly. The counting in his head had stopped. There was no past to measure, only a future to build. The journey was just beginning, and for the first time in a very long time, Caleb knew with absolute certainty that he was home.